My right glove was already slick when I drove the Raptor into Ivan's thigh. A hard, ugly shove through torn fabric and hot flesh until the metal found the place where his body had been trying to empty itself onto the concrete. The hinge bit my palm. The blades were cold, in a way blood never was, rough with dried grit and fresh slickness at the same time. Ivan bucked under me, boots skidding on the wet floor, breath bubbling between his teeth. The corridor gave every sound sharp edges. Wind moaned in the bunker vents. Loose sheet metal clattered somewhere far off. The air smelled of rust, damp, cordite, and the bright animal stink of catastrophic bleeding. I leaned harder, pinning his shoulder with my knee, head tilted right so my good ear could sort his choking from the storm outside. His pulse hammered against the tool. Military trauma manuals give you 2 minutes on a severed femoral. Your heart rate is 140. You have 40 seconds, Ivan. His eyes went wide when the math finally reached him. He spat at me and missed, because pain had already started stealing his aim. I eased the clamp, opened the width of a bad thought. A bright line of blood hit my apron, and his whole body jackknifed. The sound it made on concrete was tiny, almost polite. That was the part people never understood. Dying didn't always roar. Sometimes it dripped. Ivan clawed at my forearm, trying to peel me off. He was strong, or had been 20 seconds ago. Now he was turning shaky around the edges, fingertips losing order, jaw fluttering, skin going that gray-yellow color that said the heart was still fighting, but the war was moving uphill. I put my mouth close enough for him to smell old coffee on my breath. I control your artery. I let you live. Give me the VIP's grid, or I unclamp this and go make coffee. He cursed me in Russian first, which I took as a stall, then in bad English, which I took as surrender. I loosened the tool another fraction. He broke. Numbers spilled out. Grid, door sequence, routing tag. I repeated them back until he knew I had them right. Once he was done, I locked the clamp again and felt the vessel jump against the steel. His body hated me for saving it. Reasonable position. Mine hated me too. My burned right hand ached under the glove, where old scar tissue tightened whenever I gripped too hard. My left ear still turned sharp sounds into lies, so I worked by pressure, rhythm, weight, the stuff that still told the truth. Ivan sobbed once, furious about it. I dug out a syringe, thumbed the cap off, and slid the needle home. Good. Saves the government $40 on Epi. His pulse kicked ugly, then stronger. Not fixed, just postponed. I packed gauze around the wound, cinched him into a future he hadn't earned, and took the slate from his vest. The screen had a crack through one corner. My reflection in it looked like a corpse somebody had taught to keep moving. Blood on the apron, sweat at the temples, eyes too awake for this hour. The access node waited at the end of the corridor, behind a steel door webbed with frost. I crossed to it, while Ivan gagged behind me, and my boots whispered through diluted blood. I wiped my glove on my apron and keyed in the route Ivan had sold for another few seconds of life. The terminal asked for authorization. Standard NATO prompt. Bland font, blue-white glow. Bureaucracy always looked calm when it was about to ruin somebody. I entered the old credential from memory. Every character still alive in my hands, even if the woman attached to them had been buried on paper 3 years ago. Captain V. Reid. The screen paused. A soft processing wheel turned once, twice. In the silence, I could hear Ivan trying not to die, and the thin electrical buzz of a system deciding whether ghosts counted. Then the secondary line appeared, clean as a gravestone. KIA 3 years ago. For one beat, I saw the aid station in Syria again. Canvas tearing open under NATO fire. My team coming apart in heat and dust and screaming metal. Then I shoved that door shut. Memory was a luxury item. I pressed my thumb to the confirmation pad. The terminal chirped acceptance. Somewhere above us, alarms would be waking up. Men in clean uniforms would stare at screens and feel their stomachs turn cold. I stood there with Ivan's blood drying on my knuckles and waited for the system to notice it had been touched by a dead officer. The bunker stayed quiet for half a second, which felt almost respectful. Colonel Hayes felt the room change before he understood why. Nothing dramatic. No shouted warning, no sprinting technician, no big red movie siren. Just a small, hard shift in the air of FOB Delta Command, the kind that made keyboards slow down by half a beat. The command floor stayed cold enough to sting the sinuses. Filtered air, coffee gone stale on warming plates. Blue-white screens washing every face the same dead color. In the far corner, the Pentagon auditor sat in a black suit with a file open across one knee, turning pages with maddening calm. He had not said a word in 23 minutes. He did not need to. His silence was the loudest thing in the room. Then the central telemetry board flashed red. Hayes looked up on reflex. The VIP's cardiac line had been flat long enough to look final. 40 seconds of straight, unforgiving light. Then the waveform kicked. Once, again. Then it settled into a clean marching rhythm, so perfect it felt obscene. His collar went wet all at once. The tag beside the respiratory feed populated a fraction later. V. Reid. Even the overhead fluorescence seemed to hum lower, as if the building had started listening. For a moment he thought it had to be a software artifact, some miserable back-end sync error from a storm-damaged relay. He took one step toward the screen anyway. The EKG peaks kept arriving with machine confidence. It was neither noise nor a glitch. It was a living pattern. V. Reid remained beside it, steady and undeniable, like the system itself had decided to exhume a body and enter it on the books. Hayes swallowed. The movement stuck halfway. Valerie Reid had been useful when she was dead. Clean report, noble language, KIA, closed family packet, closed budget line, closed questions. He had signed enough paperwork around that event to bury a battalion. Seeing her name on a live feed was like watching a grave answer a radio check. He became aware of his own hands and hated them for what they were doing. One was smoothing the front of his pressed uniform. The other had started to curl near the comms console, not quite shaking, not yet. Around him, enlisted analysts kept their eyes on their stations with the desperate professionalism of people who knew when not to witness a superior officer having a private disaster in public. The auditor turned one page, just one. A dry paper sound. Hayes felt it in the back of his teeth. Optics control, he told himself. Containment. Language first, panic second. Panic had a smell, and he could already catch it on himself under the starch and soap. Cold sweat had soaked the inside of his collar and was crawling down between his shoulder blades. He keyed open the secure net with a thumb that required more effort than it should have. The board still pulsed with that resurrected rhythm. Somewhere under the bunker, a dead captain had logged into a system that was never supposed to hear from her again, and now the machine was making him own the sight of it. He did not dare glance at the auditor, which meant he could feel the man even more. The black suit remained in his peripheral vision, like a legal threat given human posture. Hayes pulled up the QRF channel, found Captain Thorn, and arranged his face into something administrative. He could not sound angry. Angry sounded personal. Personal sounded guilty. Procedure was safer. Procedure had saved worse men than him. When he spoke, his voice came out smoother than he felt, which was why he trusted it. The target is compromised by an unknown hostile impersonating a KIA officer. Execute Hostage Rescue Protocol 7. Lethal force authorized on the impersonator. The words went into the net clean and bloodless. Around him, nobody moved, except to keep pretending to work. The telemetry line continued its steady climb and fall, each bright peak another insult. Hayes muted the channel and stood very still, listening to the faint electronic hum of his command center, the rattle of distant storm wind through reinforced seams, the tiny slide of paper as the auditor closed the file in his lap. That sound was worse than a shout. Hayes forced himself to look back at the board. Reid was still there. So was the VIP's heart, beating on borrowed time, and somebody else's nerve. Protocol 7 would give the paperwork a shape. It would put armed men between the problem and the evidence. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe Thorn would kill the ghost and recover the package, and the system would settle back into its normal lies by dawn. He kept his face neutral for the room. Under the desk, his knee would not stop moving. The door came off its hinges like it had been kicked by a tank. Steel slammed concrete. Dust blew sideways through the cell entrance. Then the red laser found me and stayed on my forehead, steady as a promise. I did not look up right away. Looking up too fast at a rifle usually meant you had already accepted the rifle's point of view. I kept my mouth closed around the flashlight, its aluminum barrel hot from my teeth, and drove both hands down on the VIP's chest again. His sternum gave me that ugly, stubborn bounce living bone has when it is half a second from becoming inventory. Blood had dried in rusty fans across the floor. Fresh blood stayed brighter, slicker. The room smelled like metal, sweat, burned insulation, and the bitter medicinal reek of epinephrine hanging low in the air. Boots flooded the threshold. Men stacked left and right, black muzzles. Hard breathing behind filters and fabric. The laser trembled once, then steadied again. Not fear. Adrenaline fighting discipline. I knew the difference. I lifted my head just enough to catch the rank tabs and the finger touching the earpiece. Captain Thorn, procedure in human form. Good posture, good rifle, waiting for a voice in his ear to tell him what kind of reality he had walked into. He saw Ivan first, or what was left of him, sprawled near the corridor wall, bandaged but ruined. Then he saw me kneeling over the VIP with my apron, painted dark to the knees, and understood this was not the rescue brief he had been sold. I spat the flashlight into my palm and heard his safety discipline tighten. Tiny scrape, tiny inhale. Men like him always breathed a little shallower right before they committed to force. The beam cut across the VIP's face and showed me what I needed. Slack jaw, gray lips, no room left for error, theater, or masculine ritual. I pressed down again, counted the recoil through my shoulders. 1, 2, 3. The monitor clipped to the improvised line, twitched and steadied. Bought another few seconds. Thorn took 2 steps in, muzzle never wavering. Hands where I can see them sat in his throat even though he did not say it. His whole body said it for him. I watched his thumb brush the earpiece and made my decision before the thought had even fully formed. Not because I enjoyed gambling, because every other option in the room was dumber. I looked him in the eye and said, "Captain, 2 more steps and your radio frequency fries the pacemaker I just implanted. Kill your comms and toss me 2 bags of O negative. Now." He froze. Good. Confusion was not surrender, but it was a hinge. Behind him, one of his men shifted weight, probably deciding whether I sounded crazy enough to ignore or competent enough to fear. Thorn's eyes flicked to the cable at the VIP's chest, to my bloody hands, then back to the monitor. He was trying to calculate whether I was bluffing. I made sure I looked too tired to bluff, and too mean to care what happened if he guessed wrong. The room narrowed to mechanics. His finger touched the earpiece again. My heart did a fast, mean little climb, not from fear of dying, but from fear of him choosing doctrine over math. I hated that kind of man less than the sloppy kind. The sloppy kind was easy. The disciplined ones needed leverage. I raised the monitor lead and rapped it once against the VIP's chest, so the signal jumped on the tiny screen. Nothing dramatic, just enough to show that his life was already balanced on bad wiring and my bad mood. This channel is International Med Evac. Hayes can't jam it. You want him alive? You play by my medical rules. That landed. Not because he trusted me, because he trusted systems. And I had just named one bigger than the colonel yelling in his ear. He yanked the comms unit free, thumbed it dark, and the silence that followed felt almost obscene. No command voice, no approved language, just the hum of damaged lights and the wet drag of the VIP trying to breathe through poison. Thorn lowered the rifle a few inches, not enough for comfort, enough for oxygen. He snapped at one of his men, got the blood bags, then threw them across the floor. They skidded into a red smear and stopped against my boot. Even then, he kept the laser close to my face, like he wanted the weapon to remember he had not lost control. Fair. He had. He just hadn't admitted it yet. I caught the blood, hooked the line, and went back to work, while Thorn stood there in the stink of iron and stimulant and finally understood that everyone in the room, including him, had started operating under my rules. The first thing the bastard did when he came back around was wheeze like a punctured engine. He offered no words, no clean confession, only a ragged, high little rasp fighting its way out of a throat that had forgotten how to be useful. I swept the flashlight over his face and watched both pupils stay blown wide and black, dead to the light. Stage 3 had him by the throat now. Sweat glazed his skin. The veins in his neck stood out like blue cord under paper. He tried to lift his head and got maybe an inch before gravity reminded him who owned the room. Thorn crouched on the other side, rifle lowered but not relaxed, staring at the man like he might still turn into the mission he had been briefed to recover. The cell smelled worse now that the immediate gun oil heat had burned off. Blood, stale concrete, the bitter chemical sting of drugs, the sour edge of fear from 3 grown men pretending they were still in control of something. My hands kept moving. Tape. Pressure. Listen. Count. The VIP's chest made a thin whistling complaint every time he dragged in air. Not enough swelling to quit on me yet. Enough to make me hurry. His gaze found me and stayed there. Recognition hit him before relief did, and that told me more than any report ever could. He knew exactly who I was. Ghosts only shocked the innocent for long. He licked dry lips, failed, then tried to smile with half his mouth. Neurotoxin had made a mess of the wiring. You, he whispered, like the word itself hurt to carry. I leaned closer, head angled right to catch every syllable through the ringing in my bad ear. He smelled like acid reflux, panic, and the expensive aftershave of men who thought corruption should at least arrive well-groomed. Talk while you still have oxygen, I said. His breath skipped. He coughed. Something wet clicked in his chest. Capsule, he managed. In my stomach. Another swallow. Another awful effort to stay conscious. Fail-safe. If my heart stops, acid breaks it. His hand twitched toward his abdomen. Not dramatic, just instinctive. Guarding the secret, because greed survived longer than dignity. Data goes with me. For one beat, I felt nothing except the arithmetic. 3 minutes of dead heart. Capsule compromised. Evidence gone. Hayes walks. The official version stays official. Valerie Reid remains a casualty file, with a folded flag attached and a convenient absence where testimony should have been. Then feeling arrived after the math, which was how I preferred it. Cleaner that way. I checked his pulse again. Fast, weak, stupid. I shined the light into those ruined pupils one more time and got nothing back. Thorn watched my face like he thought he could read the verdict there. He couldn't. I did not give verdicts. I gave work orders. If this chip dies, my ghost status dies with it. I heard Thorn inhale, not because the line was poetic, because it was ugly and plain and impossible to misread. Keep this man alive or bury the truth with him. That was the whole religion now. The VIP tried to laugh and ended up choking. Froth gathered at one corner of his mouth. His chest hitched again with that ugly constricted whistle. Anaphylaxis tightening down another notch. The poison in him was doing Hayes' cleanup for free. I shoved the bloodline higher, forced the flow, and looked at Thorn. He still wanted orders from somewhere clean. Shame for him. The clean voices were finished. Stage 3 anaphylaxis. He can't walk. Get him in the striker. I pump his chest every 3 minutes. Move. He hesitated just long enough to prove he was still himself, then slung the rifle and grabbed under the VIP's shoulders. The man cried out, thin and furious, and that did something dark and useless in my chest that I ignored on principle. I took the legs. Dead weight always lied about how heavy it was. We hauled him through the blown doorway, boots slipping in blood, the hallway wind cutting colder now that the bunker had been opened up by violence and bad decisions. By the time we reached the vehicle bay, my arms were shaking from effort, not sentiment. Snow grit blew through the loading gap and melted against the blood on my sleeves. The striker sat there idling like an irritated animal, armor scarred, rear hatch open, diesel breath rolling into the dark. We heaved him inside, and he nearly coded again just from the movement. I climbed in after him, knelt, and put my hands back where they belonged. Sternum, pressure, rhythm, no revenge in it, no mercy either, just the rule. Thorn hauled himself in and slammed the hatch. The noise rang off the metal walls. He looked at me, then at the traitor stretched on the deck plates between us, and maybe for the first time, he understood what triage actually meant. This wasn't about compassion or forgiveness. It was obligation, sharpened down to a blade. Outside, engines were already moving somewhere in the storm. Hayes would not let this sit. Men would come. Bullets would come. Procedure always came dressed as necessity when cowardice needed transport. Fine, let it come. I pressed down again and felt the heart answer like an insult. The man who had sold my team for profit stayed alive under my hands because he had swallowed the only thing that could drag the truth back into daylight. I hated him. That changed exactly nothing. Drive, I said, and the striker lurched forward into the snow. The first HEAT round hit low and ugly, not with a movie fireball, but with a hard metallic punch that drove through the striker's side and through the troop bay sideways. My shoulder cracked into the bench. The white work lights died, flashed once, then came back as dim emergency red. Somewhere under the deck, metal screamed. The infusion pump beside the VIP gave one thin complaint and went black. The line sagged uselessly. The compartment filled with hot wiring, diesel breath, blood, and the bitter antiseptic stink I had been living inside for the last 20 minutes. I dropped to both knees because 18 tons of armored vehicle were bouncing across ice like physics had a personal problem with us. Brass rolled under my shins. My palms found the VIP's sternum, and I started compressions before thought caught up. Hard down. Recoil. Hard down again. His chest had that stiff, hateful spring that told me I was still moving blood. Barely. He coughed foam across his cheek. At the firing port, Thorn braced and fired into the storm behind us. My left ear gave me static. My right gave me the essentials. Incoming, rear pursuit, close. The hull kept singing after the hit, a thin, tortured vibration that made my molars ache. Another impact rattled the hull and showered us with paint chips. Thorn fired again, and the muzzle flash cut his face into white pieces. Snow glare was ruining his angle. So was the roll of the vehicle. He had the rifle, but I had the geometry. I stayed over the VIP and stole glances through the slit every time the striker pitched high enough to open the line. Tail lights bounced in our wake. Civilian truck, armored after the fact. Front heavy. Too close. Riding our 4 o'clock and trying to use our broken track through the snow, every time it hit a drift, its left side dipped harder than the right. The driver up front yelled that we were losing electrical support across the board. No kidding. The alternator had taken the hit, and the whole bay smelled like cooked copper. The VIP's pulse fluttered at his neck, then skated away again. I drove harder with both hands and felt old scar tissue in my right palm start to burn. Thorn missed high, swore, and fought a firing slit designed by people who hated human spines. I could feel every correction through the deck before I saw it through the slit. I leaned with the sway, caught the truck sliding across our wake again, and saw the left tire wobble on bald rubber. That was the weak point. I hit the next compression and shouted, "Fire! 4 o'clock! Windage doesn't matter, but their left tire is bald. Take the left tire." Thorn looked back at me like he wanted to argue with the medic using a man's chest as a hand pump. Then the striker bounced, his rifle dipped, and he remembered argument was a luxury item. He shifted his stance, jammed one boot harder into the deck, and waited for the next rise. I kept compressing. The VIP's ribs kicked under my palms. My shoulders were burning now. The truck crowded closer, trying to ride our wake. Thorn fired a pair. Sparks off ice. Miss. He corrected lower. The left wheel flashed in the slit for one bad second. And he fired again. The tire did not burst clean. It shredded, rubber peeling back while the rim bit the frozen road, and the whole truck snapped sideways like somebody had hooked it with a cable. My elbows were slick. My breath tasted like pennies and hot plastic. Their driver tried to save it, which made it worse, and the vehicle fishtailed, bit into a snowbank, rolled once, then again, heavy metal folding in on itself with a deep sound you felt in the teeth. Thorn stayed on the port one beat longer, ready for survivors, but the wreck vanished, behind us in storm haze and emergency red. Inside the bay, nothing eased. The VIP's pulse was still thin, still mean. I checked his neck between compressions and found just enough life to keep the chip in his stomach from dying with him. The striker slammed through another rut and my knee cracked against the deck plate. Pain went bright and fast up my leg. I ignored it and kept the rhythm, using the rise and fall of the vehicle like a metronome built by lunatics. Melted snow ran through blood on the floor. The dead pump hung beside me like a joke. Thorn turned from the port, pale under the red light, rifle still up but no longer aimed my way. He looked from the dead machine to my hands and finally understood the arithmetic. No alternator, no automation, just me. Body weight and bone, keeping the traitor alive because the truth was still locked in his gut. Outside, the storm kept chewing at the armor like it wanted in. The VIP seized so hard his boots hammered the deck plates. 1 second he was barely hanging on. The next his whole body arched under my hands, foam pushing white at the corners of his mouth, while his jaw snapped shut hard enough to chip a tooth. I caught his head before it cracked steel and forced it sideways. The red emergency light turned the foam pink. His pulse had gone from weak and rapid to wild and stupid. Outside, the striker kept pounding through snow with half its electrical guts cooked. Inside, the compartment smelled like blood, rubbing alcohol, hot metal, and the sulfur stink of the fight we had not quite outrun. Atropine was no place to improvise. Close enough killed people just as efficiently as bad intent. I checked his pupils again, blown wide. Wrong. The chest under my palm was still moving, but not with any discipline I trusted. I needed the exact line that had hit him. The answer sat 3 feet away against the bulkhead, folded under torn armor and drying blood. One of Hayes's men had died in the back with us during the escape. Dumped there like cargo, nobody had time to mourn. His heels drummed so hard the spent casings near his boots jittered in place. I crawled over brass and blood slick, pulled the Raptor from my belt, and jammed it under the vest seam. Kevlar tore with a nasty rip. Webbing snapped. My burned right hand tightened in protest, then kept working because pain and usefulness had been roommates for years. I shoved my hand into a cargo pocket warm with leftover body heat and blood, gauze, plastic wrapper, empty syringe sleeve. Then metal. I dragged out a used auto-injector slick as a fish and wiped it once on my apron. Not enough. Too much blood. Not enough light. Behind me, the VIP gagged and sucked in a breath that sounded like lungs trying to inhale mud. "Read it," I said. and tossed the injector to Thorn. He caught it on reflex, almost lost it when the striker lurched, then braced himself against the bench and lifted the cylinder under the red lamp. His hand was shaking. Fine tremor at first, then worse. Not fear of blood, fear of records. Men like Thorn could walk through gunfire if the paperwork still loved them afterward. The injector clicked once against the bench rail when he caught it. The VIP convulsed again. I jammed my forearm across his shoulders and held him down long enough to keep him from smashing his face into the deck. Foam threaded from his lip. Every sound in the compartment tightened around Thorn's silence. Engine growl. Snow hiss. Loose brass ticking under boots. Lot number, I said. Now. He wiped the injector with his sleeve, smearing blood across the print, then squinted harder. I could hear his breathing change before the words came. Shallower, faster. His voice came out thin, like he was trying not to let the others hear the future in it. My wife sees this on my record. I'm done. Lot number. NX774 Bravo. That landed harder than the gunfire had. This was no black market trash or battlefield salvage. It was internal stock, the kind of military neurotoxin you did not move unless signatures, clearances, and a protected asshole somewhere high up decided the risk belonged to other people. Thorn stared at the injector as if the code might rearrange itself into innocence if he kept looking. It didn't. I took it from him and turned it until the authorization line caught the light. Smudged, but readable enough to make the room feel smaller. Hayes's chain had touched it, maybe directly, maybe through his office. Either way, close enough to drag him into daylight if we survived the night. Thorn swallowed and looked younger, not softer, just stripped down to the man under the uniform. I could see the arithmetic running behind his eyes, hearing. Promotion gone. Pension gone. Wife at a kitchen table, reading a record that would stain the rest of her life too. Welcome to the chart, I said, because comfort would have been dishonest. He gave me a look that said he hated me for being right before he hated himself for needing me. Fine. I did not need loyalty. I needed function. The dead mercenary sagged open beside us, armor cut apart like a confession. The cabin stank of ethanol, blood, cooked wiring, and battlefield sulfur. Hayes had signed the poison, or come close enough for it to matter. NX774. Bravo was real. I settled back over the VIP and started building the dose in my head while the striker hammered on through snow and broken power, carrying a traitor, a shaken captain, and enough evidence to get all of us killed. The truth had a lot number now, and blood on it. By the time the striker quit on us, it was already burning from the inside out. Smoke rolled through the troop bay in greasy black layers, and every breath tasted like diesel, hot wiring, and old blood cooked back to life. Thorn got the rear hatch open with a curse and a kick. Snow blew in sideways. The VIP sagged between us, half-conscious, dead weight with a pulse. We dragged him through slush and cinders toward the abandoned aid station, squatting 30 yards off the road like a rotten tooth. Canvas flaps gone. Concrete shell left behind. Mildew on the walls. Broken cots. Rusted trays. I could hear boots outside somewhere in the storm. Disciplined spacing. Men moving to encircle instead of rush. Hayes had not sent romantics. He had sent professionals. I shoved the VIP behind an overturned treatment table and scanned the room. Oxygen cylinders chained along one wall. Old field stock. Paint flaked. Valves still intact. Good enough. A cracked concrete wall ran to my right, close enough to pin a body against if the room went bad. And a rusted gurney sat half-collapsed between me and the doorway, with one leg twisted inward like broken rebar. I crossed to the bottles and spun the first valve hard, then the second, then all of them. A shrill hiss filled the room at once, high and constant, pure gas screaming into stale air. Cold vapor curled along the floor before vanishing. Thorn stared at me, then at the doorway, then back at the bottles. He understood just enough to look sick. The room changed fast. Smells sharpened. Metal, mold, ash. My own blood from a split knuckle. Everything brighter, thinner, meaner. I checked the angles once, head tipped right to protect the good ear, and waited for the men outside to make the mistake I needed. The first flashbang hit the outer wall and rolled through the doorway with a hard metallic clatter. I tracked the sound by instinct. Bounce off concrete, skim left, hit the leg of a gurney. My body started moving before the thought did. I grabbed the VIP by the collar and hauled him lower. Thorn dropped behind the table, rifle up. Another grenade came in behind the first. That one I heard clean. My right ear kept the count. My left gave me an echo, smeared and late, the old IED damage turning space into a lie. That had been the problem for 3 years. It wasn't silence. It was distortion, a false map delivered at the exact wrong moment. I bared my teeth at the room and muttered, "Who says military medicine lacks stopping power?" The first grenade sparked where I expected it to. The second didn't. I heard the bounce a half beat too far left because the bad ear stretched it, softened it, moved it. Half a second. Maybe less. Enough to kill timing and punish arrogance. I lunged anyway, meaning to turn my face and ride the blast low. But the ignition came with the oxygen already thick in the room, and thick was all it needed. The air itself caught. Not just flame. Pressure. A bright orange sheet swallowed the doorway, sucked the breath out of my lungs, and then the whole aid station punched me sideways like a giant open hand had been waiting in the dark for years. I hit the wall with my back and right side at once. Concrete erased the world for a second. Then sound came back as a huge, dull underwater concussion, followed by tiny, sharp pieces. Glass, metal, bone maybe. Burning men outside screaming through the rupture. The blast rolled over us again in hot negative waves, pulling air, then slamming it back. I dropped to one knee because the room had tilted and my body no longer trusted the floor. When I tried to breathe, something in my right side tore open further. Pain arrived cold first, then white. I looked down and saw a jagged strip of metal buried in my flank, just above the hip. Likely a piece of the shattered gurney leg or tank hardware, wet and sunk in almost to the bend. Blood was already running around it, bright under the flicker of firelight, dripping to the floor in patient little taps. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was stupidly delicate after a blast big enough to pulp a hallway. My mouth filled with iron. I spat and got blood for the effort. Thorn was shouting. I could see it in his face before I could sort the words. One ear ringing full time now, the other fighting to separate his voice from the hiss still pouring from one surviving cylinder. The oxygen bottles had not all cooked off. One lay spinning, valve shrieking, white vapor jetting across the room like a living thing. The doorway was a frame of fire, and black shapes on the ground outside. The men Hayes had sent were not coming through that opening again. That part had worked. I ripped a wad of cotton from an old supply drawer with my left hand and jammed one piece into the left ear, then another into the right to blunt the screaming. The move hurt worse than it should have, because everything hurt worse than it should have now. My glove came away red when I pressed the wound. Good depth, bad location, worse timing. The metal was still in me, which meant pulling it would be a great way to die faster. So I left it where it had landed and forced my body vertical, by stages. The VIP was flat on his back where the blast had thrown him, chest barely moving, skin gray in the strobe of firelight. Thorn was on one knee beside him, stunned but whole, looking at me the way people look at something that has just survived the wrong math. I took one step, then another, blood tapping after me on the concrete, and every movement sent a hot tearing line from my flank out into both hands. Fine, let it. I was still on my feet. The room was ours. For the moment, that counted as luxury. The monitor was the first thing I trusted. Not the smoke, not the ringing in my ears, not the way Thorn kept glancing from the doorway to me like he wanted the chain of command to walk back in and tell him what to be. The monitor gave one ragged cluster of spikes, then a flat tone that cut through the ruined aid station like a wire pulled tight and plucked hard. The VIP's line went dead, straight and clean. Flatline. Dust drifted through firelight. Burned insulation, scorched cloth, and my own blood turned the air thick enough to chew. I was halfway to him before the pain in my side reminded me that half my body had become an argument with metal. Then Hayes came over the comms, voice blown up ugly by static and panic. "Captain Thorn, abandoned target. He is a biohazard. Put a bullet in his head to control infection. Direct order." That landed on Thorn exactly where Hayes had aimed it. His whole posture tightened. Training, fear, paperwork, survival, the old religion. He looked at the dead line on the monitor, at the blood and foam on the VIP's mouth, then pulled his sidearm and leveled it one-handed at the man's head. He was not grandstanding. That was the worst part. He was trying to obey, cleanly. My flank lit up hot enough to blur the room when I moved, but I moved anyway. I slapped the muzzle sideways with my forearm. The shot never broke. Just a hard metallic click of him checking himself at the last second, and my breath sawing out between my teeth as the wound pulled wide again. He stared at me like he wanted permission to hate me. Fair enough. I was bent half over, apron black with blood. One hand clamped to my side, the other reaching for the field defibrillator on the shelf by the wall. The machine was old, dented, still alive. Better than most people I knew. I dragged it down, ripped the leads free, and dropped to my knees beside the VIP. My fingers were already shaking before I touched the paddles. Not fear. Structural failure. The shrapnel had gone in deep, and every breath tugged muscle against metal. Pain radiated out from the wound in sharp electric threads and settled in both hands. 10 fingertips buzzing with weakness. The kind of tremor you could not bully your way through. Thorn still had the pistol up, though lower now. Hayes kept talking in his ear. Words piling up behind the static-like procedure could somehow cauterize corruption. I ignored both of them and ripped the VIP's shirt open the rest of the way. Cold skin. No useful pulse. Flatline still whining. I slapped conductive gel on the paddles and nearly dropped one when another surge of pain tore through my side. 2 seconds can be a lifetime when the heart has already quit. I lost them both there, fighting my own hands for control. I forced a breath down, tasted blood, and brought the paddles into place. My wrists shuddered. The muscles along my right side spasmed so hard my vision narrowed. Thorn saw it. Good. Let him watch the cost instead of the legend. Let him understand this was not grace. It was labor. Ugly and expensive. Hayes barked something else through the radio. Thorn's jaw locked. He was still split down the middle, one boot in the system, one boot in the ash. I did not waste language on him because language had already had its chance tonight. I looked straight at him and said, "You are aiming at my patient, Captain. Charged to 200 joules. Clear." The words hit him harder than a plea would have. Not because they were noble, because they left no room to hide. Patient. Not traitor, not asset, not biohazard. Patient. His gun wavered, then lowered another inch. He holstered it with a movement that looked almost angry and lunged for the charge switch. The defibrillator wound up with a high, insectal whine that climbed and climbed until my teeth hurt. My hands were still shaking on the paddles. The line on the screen stayed dead. The room smelled like scorched fabric, old mold, and the copper heat pouring out of my own wound. I could feel blood sliding down my side and soaking into my waistband, warm and steady. "Clear," I said again. "Lower this time." The shock hit. The VIP's body jumped off the table in one ugly full-spine arch, heels thudding wood, jaw snapping shut. Then he crashed back down. For one terrible second, the monitor gave me nothing. Just the dying tale of the tone and the charge whine draining away. My arms started to sink. Then a blip punched onto the screen. Small, mean. Another after it. Then a filthy, unstable rhythm took shape. Far from safe, but alive. Thorn exhaled like somebody had been kneeling on his chest. Hayes was still in the comms, but now his voice sounded farther away, smaller, less like command, and more like a man discovering the room no longer believed him. I set the paddles down carefully, because my fingers had begun to cramp around them. Every tendon in my hands was trembling. My flank felt wet and wrong. Fine. The patient was back. The rule held. That was all I had ever promised anybody. I pressed a dressing against the wound with one hand and checked the VIP's pulse with the other. Thin, irregular, there. The monitor kept beeping, each sound a tiny insult to everyone who had wanted him conveniently dead. Thorn looked at the revived man, then at me, and whatever was left of blind obedience in his face finally started to crack. The Black Hawk announced itself before we saw it. Rotor wash hit the ruined aid station in pounding waves that shook dust from the rafters and sent sparks skittering across the snow. Its searchlight cut through the storm in white slabs, raking over the wrecked striker, the bodies outside, and finally our doorway. Exfil on paper, cleanup in reality. I knew it from the way the bird came in low and mean instead of cautious. Thorn knew it too. I watched that recognition settle into his face like frost. This was no rescue mission. It was a cleanup, complete with a bag over the head for whoever was still breathing. The VIP lay strapped to a field cot near the wall, monitor beeping in thin, dirty intervals. My flank throbbed with every pulse it counted. Blood had soaked through the dressing twice already and dried tacky under my jacket. Outside, men jumped from the helicopter into the snow, rifles low but ready, moving with the dead calm of a team that had already been fed its lie. Thorn looked from them to me, then down at his comms unit like it had become a verdict device. The room stank of rotor exhaust, cold air, burned mold, and the med evac kit Hayes had been too arrogant to kill. Thorn crouched by the field case, thumb hovering over his service logs. Clean years, training marks, approvals, the careful brickwork of a life built for promotion. His jaw tightened. If they come through that door with Hayes' story, I said, your pension stops mattering for a different reason. He did not answer. The answer was already in his hand. His thumb pressed delete log. No speech, no ritual, just one motion on a government screen, followed by a confirmation prompt so bland it almost qualified as cruelty. He confirmed it, and the device wiped clean. I watched something go hollow behind his eyes when it finished. It wasn't courage, it was cost. Outside, the searchlight shifted and caught 3 men moving toward the station entrance. They were close enough now that I could hear boots biting frozen ground under the rotor wash. Thorn snatched the med evac cable off my kit and jammed it into his blanked unit. The connector clicked home. The open channel light went green. The speaker on the field box gave a low rising whine as the link took. He looked at me once, maybe expecting I would stop him. I just nodded toward the microphone. My side was burning badly enough to make my fingers numb. This part belonged to him. He keyed the transmit switch, and his voice went out into the storm, the helicopter, and every receiver tied to Sierra Tango 9er. Emergency code, Sierra Tango 9er. Broadcasting to Pentagon Auditor. VIP is a neurotoxin shock. Military-grade toxin, lot number NX774 Bravo. Signed and authorized by Colonel Hayes. The words did what bullets had failed to do. Even over the rotor noise, I heard the change outside. Boots slowed. One man at the doorway touched his headset and stopped reaching for the handle. Thorn kept speaking in clean identifiers, condition, chain of custody, live emergency. No sermon, no swagger. He had finally found the right blade. Our receiver spit back a slice of the FOB command net, open speaker, echoing room tone. Then Hayes' voice, stripped of polish, asking who had opened the line. Under it came another sound. Paper stopping, a chair scraping, silence arriving in a room that had finally decided which way history was leaning. I pictured the auditor lifting his head at last. The next voices were clipped and professional, and not Hayes's. Military police, one warning. Then the blunt noise of a body shoved forward over a desk. Thorn heard it. So did the men outside. Their posture changed first, rifles lowering, aggression draining out of them like somebody had opened a valve. The Black Hawk's light moved off our doorway and swung toward open ground instead. Suddenly, less like an execution lamp and more like transport for a problem that had changed ownership. Over the shared channel came the neat, ugly sounds of federal discipline. A holster stripped, rank tabs torn free, furniture knocked once, then stillness. No heroic last stand. Hayes got folded into process the way men like him always feared they might. Snow blew through the doorway and melted against the blood on my boots. The VIP's monitor kept up its thin, irregular beeping, each tone now backed by a future instead of a cleanup order. Thorn lowered the mic and stared at the wiped screen in his hand. Blank. Career gone. Retirement gone. He looked sick, furious, and freer than he understood. Outside, one of the helicopter crew waved in the neutral medical team as weapons started hitting the snow. I braced against the table because the room had begun to tilt again and blood loss was making bright little sparks at the edge of my vision. Thorn caught my elbow without thinking, then let go just as fast. We were not friends, just surviving witnesses. The channel stayed open long enough for the last thing that mattered. Hayes trying to speak and getting cut off by handcuffs closing. The neutral medics came in under the Black Hawk's wash, with a stretcher, and the kind of blank, efficient faces that meant somebody higher than Hayes had finally touched the chain. Their patches were clean, their gloves fresh, their eyes already cataloging the damage without trying to own any of it. Good. Ownership had done enough for one night. They moved past me, checked the VIP, confirmed rhythm, airway, perfusion, then lifted him in practiced silence. The monitor kept giving that thin, irregular beep, farther from me each second as they carried him toward the bird. Outside, rifles were hitting the snow around the landing zone as Hayes's men got the update and decided self-preservation was a better religion than loyalty. I stood because nobody had told my body it was finished yet. The storm clawed through the open doorway and shoved needles of cold into the gap under my collar. My flank was a furnace wrapped around a knife. Every step sent a wet drag down my side. Thorn came out behind the stretcher with my Raptor in one bloody hand, looking older than he had 30 minutes earlier. Not wiser, just more expensive. Searchlights swept over the snow and caught the apron still stuck to me, black with blood and scorched at one edge. It had started the night as equipment. By dawn, it looked like a flag from a country nobody should want to serve. I peeled the apron loose and the fabric dragged against dried blood before it let go. When I threw it down, it landed dark against the snow and stayed there, half buried by the rotor wash. No medal ceremony. No grateful handshake. Just one more contaminated thing discarded before sunrise. Around us, the landing zone had gone strangely orderly. Men who had been ready to kill us 10 minutes earlier were now standing aside while federal procedure rearranged their future. Somewhere on the shared net, Hayes was already becoming paperwork. Thorn stopped a few feet from me, clutching the shears like they weighed more than the rifle he had carried all night. Blood had dried in the hinge. Mine, Ivan's, maybe somebody else's by now. He looked from the tool to my face and failed to find the script he wanted. Good. Scripts were what had gotten him into this. Dr. Reid, where are you going? I just threw away my pension for your ghost. The line hung there between us, rawer than he meant it to. Not accusation exactly. Not plea either. Just the sound a man made when he had burned down his old life and wanted to know whether the fire had bought anything real. Behind him, The medics were loading the VIP into the helicopter. The beeping from the monitor drifted across the snow, mixing with rotor chop and blowing ice. I took one step backward into the weather, and my right side seized so hard the world flashed white. The stumble was small, just half a lost beat in the snow, but Thorn saw it. Good. Let him keep that, instead of any myth that might have been forming. My legs were shaking from blood loss, cold, and the sheer labor of staying vertical. The shrapnel in my flank felt welded in place, every breath scraping muscle over metal. I hated that he saw it. I hated it more that I cared. I tossed him the Raptor. He caught it automatically. "Keep it, Captain. Your system still has a lot of tumors left to cut out." A half smile cut through before I could stop it. Not charm, exhaustion, wearing a familiar face. He looked down at the shears, then back at me as if the tool had become a commission, a burden, maybe even a sentence. Fine. Better that than gratitude. Gratitude made people stupid. Behind him, the Black Hawk crew slammed the litter into its lock. The rotor wash thickened. Snow and ash spun together across the landing zone, whitening the tracks, hiding the blood, refusing to hide the cost. Somewhere in that storm, haze was already becoming paperwork. Somewhere beyond it, the rest of the rot was still warm and alive. Cutting out one tumor never cured a body this sick. It just proved the scan had been right. Thorn took one step after me, then stopped. He knew better now than to reach for things that belonged to the weather. The searchlight swept over us once more, flattening everything into black and white. I could feel blood leaking into the snow inside my boot prints. The cold helped. It numbed the edges without doing anything useful for the center. Each breath came shorter. Each step had to be bargained for. The med evac monitor kept beeping from inside the helicopter, slower now in the distance, as they sealed the doors. That sound followed me better than any anthem could have. The patient was alive. The evidence was alive. Haze was done, and all of it felt less like victory than triage on a larger scale, buying time, stopping the bleeding, leaving reconstruction for people who still believed institutions could heal cleanly. I backed farther into the storm until Thorn blurred into shape and movement instead of a man. He was still standing there with the bloody shears in his hand, pension gone, illusions gone, orders finally his own. Good. Someone would have to stay and cut where I couldn't. Then the snow took the rest of him too, and the rotor noise faded behind the weather while the beeping thinned until it almost disappeared. I kept moving because stopping would have been death dressed as rest, and because ghosts only stayed useful as long as they never let daylight finish counting them.